The Rings of Power has released on Amazon Prime, and everyone is asking the same question: is it any good? First, I want to emphasize that I am basically no one. I am not a corporate shill. I don't have a degree in filmmaking. I'm just somebody who likes to read a lot of fantasy, has written some books that have not been published, and likes Lord of the Rings. I also did a whole video series on The Wheel of Time when that dropped on Amazon Prime because that was one of my favorite book series growing up, and unfortunately, I did not like that series. I've liked it less over time since I initially reviewed it, and I was genuinely concerned that I would not like The Rings of Power. I'm also not really a YouTube influencer. You can tell by the lack of quality in my videos and production that I don't rely on YouTube for my income. I do this pretty much on the side. That also means that I am not incentivized to produce videos that manufacture outrage just to get people riled up enough to like, comment, and subscribe. Although I would prefer if you do that, please do that. So far, The Rings of Power is pretty good. It's not amazing yet, but only 2 episodes have come out and I'm invested. I would like to watch more. If there was a 3rd episode, I would be watching it right now. So overall, I think it turned out okay. Compare that with when I watched The Wheel of Time and I did my video on the first 3 episodes, and the title was, "What the hell did I just watch?" because it was so jarring and disappointing and different from the series that I remembered reading growing up. Whereas for this, I didn't have the expectations of an adaptation of a book series that I loved. I've known all along that The Rings of Power was going to be an original story based on the appendix that is at the end of The Lord of the Rings about the Second Age, which spans 3,400 years plus. So I did not expect the story to be an adaptation of a narrative. I knew it was going to be original, and whether or not I enjoyed it was going to depend on the writing, the quality of the cinematography, the costumes, the design, the music, the actors, the acting, all of those things that go into making a television show entertaining. And I gotta say, I liked the first 2 episodes. They're doing okay so far. Do I know if I'm going to like the whole series? No, it could fall apart some point in the middle, and there are some things in The Rings of Power that are distinctly not in line with what I know of Tolkien's lore, but it's not so off-putting that it throws me out of the story and makes me think, what am I watching and why did they make these decisions? It's appealing overall. The set designs and costumes offer incredible eye candy, and they do not look cheap, at least they don't to me. The acting is good, and so far the writing is pretty good. And that includes the dialogue, which I was worried about. Overall, I think the show feels like Middle-earth. Yes, even with mixed races playing characters that probably wouldn't look like that in locations like this if this was the real world, but this is not the real world. It's not even scientifically trying to be a world, it's a mythology. I also think that the varying kinds of English accents that they give all the characters and the consistency with which they do that helps a lot. I mentioned that the show isn't accurate to all of the lore, at least not completely, but I do think that it's being respectful to Tolkien as a, intellectual property. I think that the show comes off as very meticulous, very thorough, and the writing is very structured. Each scene is purposeful, the characters all have understandable motivations, and the story moves along towards the next scene in a way that makes logical sense, at least so far. There is creative license, but for the most part, what they chose to do seems to fit within the construct of this story. It adds to the entertainment, it's not leaving me wincing or cringing or head-scratching with, why did this character do this when they said that their motivation was that? It feels more or less intentional. In other words, The Rings of Power is a lot better than the Wheel of Time series, thank goodness. As time goes by and I look back on the Wheel of Time series, I am increasingly disappointed. I'm hopeful that The Rings of Power will be a largely positive experience that will leaving me having to compartmentalize some ideas that are not strictly Tolkien, but which I can still enjoy for the context in which they are presented. And let's get into that a little bit. The entire narrative of the Rings of Power is completely invented, and that is exactly what I expected and what I tried to explain would be the case in previous videos about this series. But I won't be surprised if other people are surprised by just how much is being made up. The books don't say what Galadriel was doing during this time, so the writers can make it up. They can make up stories about what the wizards were doing, about what the Harfoots were doing, and about characters in the Southlands. They can do whatever they want, and they have to create, they have to invent, because they have to tell a story and not a laundry list of events that happened during a point in history, which is what the appendix gives you. And I think so far they're doing a decent job of it. Let's talk about how the show opens with that prologue of the elvish children playing in a grassy field near a creek in Valinor, somewhere at the dawn of the world. At first I was a little worried about that scene because I never think about elvish children because we never really see any in the books and they're rarely mentioned in the stories, and when they are, they tend to be when they're older. But obviously elves were children at some time, so this isn't completely inconceivable, and the whole purpose of that scene was to demonstrate just how long-lived this race of beings is and how innocent they are to how the world works. And I think they also were trying to establish very rapidly who Galadriel is and her relationship with her brother, because he dies and serves as the motivation for her trying to ensure that the world is rid of Sauron. And that is important within the context of this story that they are telling within the Second Age. This is actually good writing technique. We would like this show less if they gave us this giant exposition and info dump about what all of these characters were doing between the dawning of the world until now. That would have been a slog. So I actually like that they're focusing on just what we need to know with a story that they're going to tell during this kind of ambiguous period in the Second Age that obviously takes place before the forging of the rings, or at least before the forging of some of the rings, and Sauron's re-rise to power. So I don't know exactly where we are, and I do think the timeline is a little bit muddled, but we're somewhere around there. I was actually impressed with how rapidly they were able to condense all of the exposition leading up to this place in the story. We learned that there was a dawning of the world, that the elves came from another land, that there was light in the trees, that some being, which is not explained, named Morgoth, stole their light, and that they have been at war with him and his servants ever since. But when this particular story opens, there is a sense of peace and hope that the war has ended and that everyone can move on, and that even Galadriel herself may be able to, like they say, lay down her sword and return to Valinor. However, she has reservations and some suspicions that Sauron is still at large and that that would be the wrong thing to do. Is all of that in Tolkien's written appendix on the Second Age? No, some of it is and some of it's invented, but I think it works okay, and I'm enjoying the story, even understanding that this is, you know, fan fiction written in the Middle-earth universe, but so far it's pretty good fan fiction. One thing that did strike me as odd in these first two episodes is the relationship between Galadriel and Elrond as presented. I don't really remember them having a friendship, at least not this early in the timeline. I do know that Galadriel is Elrond's mother-in-law, that her daughter marries Elrond, although I think that doesn't happen until the Third Age, and that they have Arwen, who later marries Aragorn. I also know that Elrond is a half-elf, and that that is not really brought to bear in this story so far, although we might hear about it more in future episodes when it looks like Galadriel and this wayfarer Halbrand will visit the Númenóreans, who are descended from Elrond's half-elven brother, Elros. I also seem to recall that Celeborn was the one with the relationship with the dwarves, that his interest in smithy and their interest in smithy resulted in them creating projects together, including aspects of the Mines of Moria, and so he should not have had to go to Elrond with assistance for that, but I'm gonna let it slide. I also know that the character of Celeborn in particular has been through like a lot of iterations in the Legendarium. I think he's, even like who he's descended from kind of varies depending on which text you're reading. So it's fine. It's not like an important character, or at least not enough to me where I really, really want that to be 100% accurate to the books. But I can understand if that bothers Tolkien purists, especially because it seems like that character would have a good relationship with the dwarves given their mutual interest in the forging of beautiful things. But we'll have to see how it develops. Maybe they're going to build upon that relationship in future episodes and bake it into the actual narrative story, even if that's not how Tolkien rolled about it in his Legendarium. So when we are first introduced to Galadriel in the beginning of this show, she is shown, as people have complained, as a woman of valiant courage and, in this case, a strong determination to end the evil that took so much from her. Personally, I'm not bothered by Galadriel wearing armor and wielding a sword and being a strong fighter. I think that is plausible for a period of her life where we don't know much about what she was doing. I would still want to see her develop into the character that we know in The Lord of the Rings as the Witch Queen of Lothlorien, who is tempered in her desire for power, because we do know that Galadriel, from the time that she was in Valinor, desired a dominion of her own. And so in coming to Middle-earth and establishing that dominion, I can see her having had a more militant expertise than was perhaps recorded in the history. So that personally does not bother me. I liked the scenes with Galadriel and this version of the story that takes place in Middle-earth. And as I have mentioned in previous videos, the patriarchy in the stories that Tolkien wrote are somewhat suffocating, and even those of you who think that Tolkien could not possibly have been sexist because he is such a wonderful man, it's not necessarily the case. People can be wonderful writers and generally progressive for their time and still be somewhat behind the times when it comes to things like that. I think that this show is making a conscious effort to modernize that aspect of the story and give women more prominent parts. Also introduced in these first couple of episodes are some other character arcs between different races and tribes on Middle-earth. So we are introduced to the Harfoots, and this was the grouping that I was the most worried about for the Rings of Power just kind of not making sense within this timeline of the story, but I liked the Harfoots. I particularly liked how they were introduced with all of the kind of pop-up village that they have as these traveling nomadic peoples, and I liked the character of Nori and her curiosity and how all of her relationships with her friends and siblings and elders of the village worked into kind of a just humorous take on peoples living at this time, which the show could use because the elven stories can be pretty stiff, and I think that the lightheartedness that this character brings can be a fun thing to watch. I was really worried about it, but I rather enjoyed it. So no real complaints there. And I especially like how they introduced, I'm assuming it's one of the Astari, the wizards, that falls to Middle-earth. I don't know which wizard it is. I'm going to guess it's one of the blue wizards, because I think it'd be strange if they introduced Gandalf in the story, but it's not impossible. It could be Gandalf, or Saruman even, or Radagast. But regardless of whoever it is, I kind of like that this being crashes to Earth and has no concept of how to live in the world as a creature of matter. What I get, or the impression that I get from those scenes, is that this is somebody who has never had flesh before and doesn't understand things like eating and grass and sunlight and flame, and is trying to get his message across to these peoples. He has come with an urgent message, but it's going to take him a while, maybe decades, hundreds of years even, to be able to articulate why he came and what it is he's trying to do. And that could be a pretty interesting conflict for that character and the Harfoots that he is introduced to when he lands on Middle-earth. So elsewhere in this story, we are introduced to Arendir in the Southlands, and I thought that conflict was interesting as well, although a little less interesting, just a little bit, than some of the other ones. I think in part because I don't quite have a sense of where that one is going as much, although they do introduce some interesting elements. I'm less interested in Arendir's romance with this woman, which I'm actually happy to say they underplayed in a good way. We can tell that these characters like each other, that they're sad that they might have to be separated, but it's not like this is going to be a romance of enduring love that has been torn apart because of tensions, etc., etc. I mean, it might go there at some point, but they didn't play too heavily in these opening scenes. It is more of a, I would say, kind of cool affection between these two characters, which I liked. And then this woman has a son, and her son might end up becoming a villain. We're gonna have to see. But he does find that sword that belongs to the armies of Sauron under the house, which shows that these villagers are descended, or I'm not sure for how long, but they were at one point part of either Sauron's or Morgoth's armies. And that's a pretty interesting conflict, and I like how Arendir having this romantic affection for this woman and her having obviously a obligation to her son can create some pretty interesting conflicts for future episodes. It will depend on how they handle it, but overall I thought that was pretty interesting. And then we have Elrond's character and his call to assist the High King of the Elves, Gil-galad, I believe it is, with some urgent call to action. And initially we see Gil-galad telling everyone, the war is over, we're all going to be allowed back to the Grey Havens, or at least some of us who are ready to retire will be allowed to do that. And then he gets this message through the leaves withering in his homeland that something is amiss, and next thing we know, Elrond is being sent to Celeborn on some secret project. Celeborn is asking to build a forge. Elrond suggests that they enlist the help of the dwarves to do this, and I think all of this is going to be leading to forging the Rings of Power. And it could be that Sauron is already busy at work forging rings for the Dwarven kings. We see a glimpse of what maybe was in that box, could have been a ring for the Dwarven king of Moria, and possibly also for the kings of men, but we don't know that for certain yet. We do know that Galadriel has found some evidence of Sauron trying to create something in these various abandoned strongholds, all the places that she has been tracking him. So overall, the story is set up as a series of mysteries, small mysteries, that each individual character is solving, and which will all converge into one epic as the story progresses over what I assume will be 8 episodes, because Amazon shows always are 8 episodes. And then in episode 2, or I should say at the end of episode 1, we even get a full character arc of Galadriel thinking, okay, maybe I am being a bit over obsessive, and she decides to accept the offer to go to the Grey Havens, which to my knowledge is not in anything Tolkien wrote, but I do think that they are taking some creative license with some commentary that was made about why Galadriel had not returned to Valinor during all of this time, and are just spinning it into part of the narrative for the story. Again, I'm going to be more lenient on this than some Tolkien purists, as long as I'm enjoying the story and it doesn't directly contradict anything super egregious. I'm going to just roll with it as a clever fantasy tale. So Galadriel's on this ship heading towards Valinor, and then decides right when they're going into the light that she is not ready to leave, that she has unfinished business in Middle-earth, and chooses instead to retake up her dagger in this case, jump overboard, and I guess swim back to Middle-earth. And I joked a little bit about this, like, the chances of surviving something like that are extremely low, but elves are also very hardy and have done crazier things in the written tales as Tolkien wrote them, so very possible that Galadriel has a sense that she can survive this and chose to do it knowing what her odds were. At any rate, she gets a little bit of a break because she runs into some humans hailing from, they don't say where, but I'm going to guess they're from either Numenor or some other lands that have been invaded by Sauron's rising armies. She meets this person who calls himself Halbrand. We don't know if that's his real name. They don't get off at first, but then he saves her life, she saves his life, one of those character bonding moments, and I suspect that they will forge at least a friendship throughout the course of this show, unless he ends up turning evil, which is possible. So we will see what happens with this story. It does look like in future episodes they will be going to Numenor together. It is possible that we'll find that he is an ancestor of Aragorn, but we don't know at this time. Like I said, he could be good, he could be evil, to be determined. So holistically, do I like the Rings of Power? So far, I'm going to say yes. I like this show. I'm not going to give it a rating because I want to see the whole show unfold, but I really think that this is a much, much stronger opening than the Wheel of Time series that Amazon produced, and I am very thankful for that because Amazon does have other hit shows. If you haven't watched The Boys, that's very good. And then it has some duds like, unfortunately, The Wheel of Time. But The Rings of Power is a show that they have heavily invested in. So I am hoping it's going to be good because I want to be a positive, optimistic person. I am not here to spread outrage. I like for there to be good stories on television with a fantasy vibe that are fun to watch, that I can look forward to subsequent seasons year over year. So I want this show to be good. I am not invested in it being bad so that I can have outrage on my channel and something to talk about week to week. If I love the show and it's not interesting, I'll just stop talking about it and start talking about something else. Overall, I think that the criticism of this show has been wildly overblown by people who are trying to start something to further their own agenda, whether that's just clicks and likes or because they have some kind of political stake in this show failing. I do think that the PR stunts that they did for Rings of Power, was it like last year, were in pretty bad taste, and they shot themselves in the foot a little bit with those marketing efforts. But the actual show so far is entertaining, and I think we should all give it a chance. If you like what I had to say and want me to continue making videos, do please like and subscribe and comment. It is entertaining for me to get that kind of positive feedback after all of the effort it takes to put something like this together, even though I put less effort into it than some influencers on YouTube. But I am enjoying myself. If you would like to see more, please let me know. Until next time.